Hi everybody, this is a new little series I'm going to be doing on screenwriting and story structure and storytelling. I'm going to be showing a couple different things in here, but first of all, I would like to start talking about a basic story structure. A quote here from William Goldman, the guy that wrote the screenplay for The Princess Bride and the Maverick. Screenplays are structure. Some people will have stories and really good stories in their heads, and you have to kind of realize that when you're writing a story that you have to structure it in order to make it interesting. Now, a lot of the structure I'm going to be talking about here is fairly conventional structure. It's kind of the structure used by Hollywood and a lot of independent films. Pretty much, even if they are independent, kind of the weirdo independent films as well, they will usually follow some sort of structure, some sort of a structure that's been out there that's existed for some time. The most common story structure that we use for our current day storytelling in most movies and a lot of books and just basic storytelling is based off the three-act story structure. I shouldn't say this is based off of Aristotle's Poetics because Aristotle is not the one that created the three-act story structure as much as he observed it. This type of storytelling has been around for literally thousands of years, and he basically, in his work called Poetics, if you haven't read Poetics, I'd recommend it. You'll be able to find it as a PDF online. It's almost a very philosophical approach to storytelling and what makes storytelling function and what makes it function properly. A lot of the works had been around for some time. He was reading and observing, and he kind of stated what is it that makes those things work, basically. What makes a story function? What makes a plot function? And he put a heavy emphasis on plot, actually, on the events that happen throughout a storyline. Anyway, it's a three-act story structure. Some other things Aristotle I'll talk about this in a future episode. He lays out 6 episodes of a story, which is basically plot, character, diction, thought, spectacle, and song. And and one thing that he heavily concentrates on is right here, plot. Plot is what really deals with the three-act story structure. It's what events happen and when, and how much time you spend on each one of those. Aristotle states that a plot must have a beginning, middle, and end. It must also be what he calls universal in significance. And these, I kind of think of Hollywood films or the films that do really well. Even in special niche markets, films will usually be universal in significance, we should say, to those people that are filling that niche. But yeah, they'll have a determinate structure, maintain the unity of theme and purpose. We'll get into theme later on as well. But right now, we're going to be concentrating on plot. And once again, plot is defined as the events that happen in a story, all the events that happen to a character within a story and around that character. So the three-act story structure. We basically have Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. Act 1 is the beginning, Act 2 is the middle, Act 3 is the end. And you can pretty much look at this as the beginning is kind of looked at as a setup. The middle is looked at as an execution, and Act 3, the end is looked at as a resolution. So you have basically a setup, execution, and resolution. So within Act 1, these are some of the items that you're going to be seeing. First of all, this is like I called this is usually called the setup. A few things that you do. You introduce a protagonist. A protagonist is a main character in a storyline. If you're looking at something like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom or Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark, the protagonist in these storylines is Indiana Jones. Very obvious. It is kind of the hero of the story. If you look at very common movies, Star Wars, Luke Skywalker would be the protagonist as well. And then if you look at a movie like Bridesmaids, Annie Walker is the protagonist of the film. It's the character that we're following the most. It's the character that we're sympathizing and connecting with the most. And oftentimes when we introduce that protagonist, the protagonist is in a state of what we call homeostasis. That means this character is kind of doing their day-to-day thing, kind of stuck in their day-to-day. Maybe it's oftentimes a mundane life that's where nothing exciting is going on. That's not always, you don't always have to do this, but usually you'll see this in films because that makes it a little bit more interesting when something large happens to them at the end of Act 1 that kind of pulls them out of that, threatens to pull them out of that homeostasis. But what makes that conflict that's introduced at the end of Act 1 even more interesting is the nature of that homeostasis that the character is in. You introduce very specific characteristics that are going to come in direct conflict with something later on in Act 1. And oftentimes these characteristics can introduce a sense of irony, which basically means if a person is, let's go very cliche here, if a person is afraid of heights and they end up having to climb a high mountain or something like that, that would make the situation more interesting. It would make the conflict deeper. And that's what makes more of an interesting story, is this kind of sense of irony. The characteristics that you decide to introduce in Act 1 are going to drive that conflict later on. So after we do that, we introduce a protagonist, we introduce the characteristics. Those characteristics will come in direct conflict with some sort of antagonizing force, or some sort of, whether it is an antagonist, an actual person, or if it's an actual situation where they have to deal with it. And then the conflict is introduced. And usually this kind of coincides, at the end of Act 1, this coincides with what we call a life-changing event. Something kind of big happens that pulls that character out of their homeostasis and throws them into the story. At the end of Act 1 in Star Wars is where Luke Skywalker's aunt and uncle get killed. And this conflict begins when Neo takes the red pill in The Matrix as well. So that is something that causes that life-changing event and throws that character into the story. Act 2. This is usually the largest act here. And Act 2 is the section of the movie of the storyline where the protagonist battles to overcome the conflict. And this can often take place several times where they're trying to overcome a conflict, and they usually fail several times in an attempt to overcome that conflict. They will try, they will fail, they try again, they fail. And usually by the end of Act 2, that's what Act 2 is all about, is overcoming that conflict and learning to deal with it. Usually by the end of Act 2, the protagonist may have failed several times and finally has some sort of epiphany moment, and that's the moment when they kind of realize what they really needed to do to overcome the conflict. Usually something they don't like. Usually it leads to a breaking of their own rules. Usually a moment like this can be introduced by perhaps a mentor or somebody trying to aid the protagonist and lets them know kind of an alternate route they can take. This epiphany moment happens in The Matrix, where Neo finally realizes that he has to go back in to rescue Morpheus. And when he does that, he realizes that if he goes back in and rescues Morpheus, that he's going to die instead of letting Morpheus die. So after they have that epiphany moment and they realize what they really need to do to overcome the conflict, we move to Act 3. And this is the moment this is the act of resolution. And this is where the protagonist usually attempts one big final time to overcome the conflict. This is kind of the all or nothing moment that they push forward and really try to overcome that conflict. Whether or not they win, this problem is solved or resolved to some extent within the storyline. And the protagonist has gone through what we call a character arc. The protagonist has changed. Even if the problem has been solved or not, the protagonist has gone through the story as a changed person. And oftentimes they might even end up in the same place where they were in the first place. They might go back to homeostasis, go back to the life they had before, but they have gone through this situation and they've come through a changed person, and they have learned something, and they have learned something from the whole situation that they've been put through. And I think the reason why the 3-act story structure works so well, it kind of mirrors the way we look at life. We have many problems that present themselves to us, many conflicts that come, and we learn to deal with it, and we try to overcome it and resolve it to some extent. And the stories that are more interesting are the ones that have a heavy sense of irony. There's something that we are just totally not expecting, or something that we are just totally against, and it just comes and hits us anyway, and we have to get creative to figure out a resolution to that conflict. And I think that's what makes a more interesting story. So this has just been a basic introduction to the 3-act story structure. We will get more complex and more deep later, but those are the basics. In my next episode, I'm going to be getting into a basic screenplay structure. So go ahead and watch that and post any comments if you have them. If you're interested in seeing the rest of my screenwriting modules that I'm doing right now, you can visit youtube.com/chinfat, and that'll take you to my page here. On my page, if you go under playlists, you'll find the screenwriting playlist, and you can click on that and look at the rest. Right now it says no videos because this is before I'm uploading. So yes, just go to the screenwriting playlist and you'll find all the modules that I keep putting on screenwriting there, and you can watch them all. So watch them all, subscribe, and other stuff. Thanks.